Hi, this is Chris. Thank you, Donna. You're one of my favorite humans, and you are too, Jen. Okay, it's 106, or it feels like it's 106 degrees here. It's 95, but it feels like it's 106 apparently. And let's see if my brain is working today or not. We're just going to pick up where we left off on Tuesday. So hopefully many of you joined us on Tuesday. On Tuesday, Jen took the lead and talked mostly through, pretty comprehensively through understanding the development of communication on a pre-symbolic and early symbolic level, in the levels or stages of communication development that are represented on the communication matrix. She introduced you to our, I'm trying not to call it a tool. What are we calling it again? A document or a resource. The Augmentative and Alternative Communication AAC CVI matrix, which is basically a combination of the results of the communication matrix and the CVI range. And it's looking at how you can deduce recommendations through a set of pretty comprehensive considerations or guidelines for what might be an appropriate communication system or ways to adapt appropriate communication systems for students with CVI, depending on where they fall on the CVI range in terms of their visual functioning. And then on the other hand, where they fall on the communication matrix in terms of their expressive communication. So if you didn't catch the first session, some of this might be a little bit of catch up, but we'll go through and sort of refer to things that we talked about a little bit and maybe explain them again a little bit. Today, we're going to talk more about the implementation aspect in terms of communication modalities. And let me see. Yes, Jen is answering some questions in the chat box too. Okay, so I'm going to pick up where we left off, which was a pretty convenient place to leave off, discussing tangible symbols. Okay, and I think I want to emphasize that when we talk about using tangible symbols, that might look different for a child with CVI. In fact, it will look very different for a child with CVI as opposed to how we usually talk about tangible symbols from the context of a child with an ocular visual impairment. If you use tangible symbols, if you've used the various different types from the Texas School for the Blind or from the American Printing House for the Blind, the STACS, STACS tangible symbols, that's the kind that you see on the top right of the screen there in the example for music. You probably think of those as symbols that will be experienced tactily. So that's going to look different for a child with CVI, who is primarily a visual learner. So there will be different considerations that we'll talk through a little bit as we go. So instead of just thinking of these as tactile, tangible symbols, we want to think of them as concrete symbols. We can sort of talk about it in a different way. These are concrete symbols for students who are in between that stage of unconventional and communication and the development of first words and language. And for many of our students, this may be an important stepping stone in the development of symbolism and eventually of language. Okay, so let's take away the term tangible symbols for a second, and we'll talk about concrete symbols. So concrete symbols can be a variety of different things. They can be whole objects. They can be parts of objects. They can be associated objects, right? Objects or pieces of objects that connect to or relate to or associated with an activity or a person or an object, a thing. They could be textures or shapes, which is a little more abstract. They could be line drawings or photographs, and that's where it's a little different. We don't usually talk about tangible symbols, including line drawings and photographs, but concrete symbols may be photographs. They're not words, they're not abstract, they're not language, but they're concrete symbols that represent an activity, a thing, a person, or an object. Whatever you choose, depending on your individual student, if you have a student who's at this level of communication, whatever you choose, consider, of course, the individual needs of that student in terms of their current vision, their current tactile skills, their current communication development, also their personal experiences. Consider the level to which that concrete symbol is abstract or concrete, and that's called iconicity. So the first, and we're going to talk about that a little more in a second. The first question you should be asking yourself before you think about using this type of a communication modality is, does the student have symbolism or symbolic representation? Symbolism is the understanding that a symbol refers to an object, a person, an event, an activity. So in order for there to be symbolism, when you ask, does my child have symbolism? What you're really asking is, does my student have the connection between a symbol and what the symbol refers to? So to have symbolism, there must be a symbol. In this case, we're going to use a water bottle cap, right? So we got the cap. That's a very concrete symbol to represent this water. So you've got the symbol. It's not the water itself. The water itself, if you communicate with the object itself that you're using, that's not a symbolic interaction. That's just object communication, which is okay. And some kids may be at that level where they really need also to look at the objects and, experience the objects that are related to an activity before that activity starts, to preview those things in a really tangible, concrete way. But that's not symbolic representation. That's just communicating with objects. For symbolism, you have to separate the object from the actual thing that's being used in the activity. So the water bottle is no longer anywhere near, and now we're using the cap to communicate about the object. And we could say, do you want the water or time for water? And the child's going to look at it or touch it or some combination of that. So we've got the symbol, the water bottle cap, and then we've got the referent, the thing the symbol refers to, which is water. So does your child or student understand that connection, not just receptively, but are they able to use that expressively in order to request, refuse, seek out information about, or then in social cases to socialize with a symbol? Remember, we talked last time, Jen spoke about the 4 functions of communication, 4 primary functions. So,
and Chris?
Oh, go ahead, Jen.
Can I just say that sometimes for our students, what the issue in getting to this point, in recognizing that symbol refers to the referent, is if they're not fully engaged in the activity. So if we say, show the student a water bottle, and then off to the side, we unscrew the cap and pour it into a cup and give them water, if they're not part of that process of removing that cap and seeing that thing came off of this thing, so they're connected, that's where that disconnection happens, that they don't make that symbolic transition.
Yeah, this is Chris. Thank you, Jen. Thank you so much. That's a really good lead into, as we talk about how your symbol choice also should relate to your child's experiences, right? So if your child hasn't had a complete experience with what this means, what this water bottle cap means, and the activity that it's associated with, then it really has limited meaning and it's not very concrete. It's abstract. So that's a really good point. So what we're talking about in terms of the level to which any specific symbol, the water bottle cap, a photo, a word, any symbol, a line drawing, the level to which it's concrete or abstract, you can think of as like a scale. And that scale is the scale of its iconicity, the extent to which it's conceptually. And then in our case, it's really important to think about the visual complexity for CVI, how that relates to it being abstract or concrete too. So you've got 3 basic stages of iconicity for any symbol. There's an icon, and an icon is a symbol that bears a strong resemblance to the thing it refers to the referent. How does it bear a strong resemblance? That depends on our student, right? Does it bear a strong resemblance visually or tactily, depending on if your student's a visual or tactile learner? So it's important, even though this looks like a water bottle, if your student has a different visual or tactile experience with water, that's not very concrete. It's no longer an icon. So an icon bears a strong resemblance. We can look at this and say, oh yeah, that looks exactly like the water bottle that it refers to. The next level is an index. And an index is a symbol that does not bear a strong resemblance to the referent, but it bears some resemblance. It just requires some additional background concepts in order to make that connection. Okay? And some of those concepts are actually somewhat abstract. So we're looking at the middle there of one of those classic Boardmaker, Mayor Johnson symbols, or PECS, P-E-C-S symbols. And we can look at that if we're visual learners who have a big visual vocabulary. We can look at that and say, oh, I know why that's water, because there's even though it's kind of a very simple cartoon line drawing, there's a faucet there, and I've seen faucets that look like that, so I can identify that that's a faucet. I know that water in cartoons is represented as being blue, even though we know water's clear, right? And it depends what water you're looking at. So there's a lot of background concepts here. Those squiggly lines represent water. There's a lot of background information that's needed in order to be able to look at that and deduce what it means. And I think we take that for granted very often with our students. And we're going to look at how that relates to CVI more specifically even, but I think that's true for all students. Then you have the most abstract is a true abstract symbol. And a true abstract symbol bears no resemblance whatsoever to the referent. Okay, and you could type in the chat box if you figured out why that third symbol I showed you is water. Why would that be the symbol for water? Anybody figure it out yet? Great, H2O. Okay, I think Christy wins the prize for typing it in first. Right, we can look at that, and because you have a lot of abstract concepts in your mind, you can understand what that means. It's the molecular structure for water, right? Now, I think we could all accept that we would never use that as a symbol for one of our students, right? That would be ridiculous. Why would we do that? But how often do we use an index and we're actually making the same kinds of assumptions, that our student has all of these background concepts and associations that are really quite abstract, just because when we look at it, we can make a quick connection and understand it. So that's not to say that an index is never okay for a student with CVI, but I think more often than not, we need to get more concrete, and we need to be thinking about that child's visual vocabulary. Okay, rather than just something that looks like water to us who do not have a visual impairment, who do not have a visual processing disorder. Okay, so consider that your students who are using indexes, do they need something more concrete? Do they really need an icon? Okay. Also, what's unique to CVI, and I think this is true for kids who are deafblind in general as well. If you have children who have limited visual vocabulary and maybe even limited participation in whole experiences, then what is concrete or abstract to them, like Jen was saying, really has to do with their individual experiences. Is this your child's experience with water, this water bottle? Well, if not, then it's actually very abstract if they've never encountered a water bottle like that before. Or is this their experience with water, a specific water bottle, or like a canteen, right? One that they always have with them. Or is it a cup that they always use? Or is it a water fountain? Or are there different experiences with water, and now you're going to have to go through the process of trying to select, well, which one should I choose? Which one best represents water? So the point, and there's no correct answer, is individual. The point is that iconicity, like visual novelty in CVI, is totally relative to individual experience. So you're going to have to do this on an individual basis, and that's why we can give you considerations and guidelines and things to think about, but the decisions need to be made, the specific decisions about symbols should be made on an individual basis. And that's why a universal symbol system for a child with CVI is a ridiculous concept, because kids with CVI have unique experiences and unique visual vocabulary. Just like you can't have a salient feature dictionary that works for every single child with CVI. You've got to individualize. Just like you can't have the same CVI schedule for every student. You have to create it based on your child's individual development and experiences and needs. And that's why we need to be really thoughtful. So what we've done in our communication AAC CVI matrix is we've given you all of the considerations that you might take to figure out and ask yourself, what are all of the various factors I need to be making sure I'm on top of? Okay, we're going to walk through that a little more today too. And Jen, definitely jump in if you have more too. Oh, Jen, I think this one's you. Sometimes you look at a slide that you didn't create and you're like, I don't know what that is.
Yep. Yeah. So this symbol hierarchy is actually following an example that is on the APH website or the APH site in regards to discussing the use of tangible symbols. So, of course, our hierarchy of symbols, where we should start from, is the whole or identical object to what the child uses. So, for example, in this situation, if we associate the child's shoe with going for a walk or leaving the house, the best thing for them to use as an object to identify with activity is their shoe, because they would take their shoe, go get the other one, we put it on our foot, and we go. It's directly associated. As we see with a hierarchy, as we were talking about with having a schedule system that grows with the child, we always want to be thinking ahead as we choose objects and as we plan how we're going to move along the hierarchy. So, for example, if your partial or associated object that you're going to use next, not the entire whole object, but is still something that is closely identified to it. Maybe while you're using that child's shoe, every time, if say it's this Velcro one, like you see here, every time we take the shoe and say, oh, yep, it's time we're going to go for a walk, we take the Velcro off, put it back on, take the Velcro off, put it back on. Why? Because that action will be something that they remember when we move to a partial or associated object. Maybe you're putting on just the strip of Velcro that you're going to mount, and that's going to become your symbol. Because then again, when you use that with the child, they can practice taking the Velcro off and putting it on and using that same action that they did with the whole shoe. So we're still making those connections. Or if it's a shoe with ties with laces, maybe they're helping you, via hand under hand to feel the laces as you tie their shoe for them. So again, you're getting that same tactile experience when we move to something that's more abstract or symbolic. After we move to that, that's when we can start putting in photos or picture symbols, depending on what the child needs in regards to CVI. And this is the same place where some tangible symbols will come in. But as you can see, that picture on top is one of those, what was it, specs? Is that what you called it? It's one of the pre-made, the kit that you can pre-make the symbols that comes from APH. And this one looks like it's supposed to be for the bus driver. But think of this, if we were choosing this for a child with CVI, how much prior information does that student need to be able to associate this little rubber circle with a ball in the middle, even as the bus? Think of that. Do they have the visual ability to take in an entire bus? Okay, maybe, maybe not. Then we get down to, well, okay, this is supposed to represent the wheel of a bus. How often do we take our students over and have them, feel the wheels of a bus? Because if we're going to explore this tangibly, or tactily, my assumption is that it feels rubbery to somewhat associate with the feeling of the wheel of a bus. But how often do we have our kids feel what a wheel feels like? Is this the same feeling? It's in a miniature version. So all of those pieces together, just think how much prior information our students would have to apply to a symbol like this to be able to understand what it's associated with. And then if we get past that section, then it would be print or braille, which is more abstract. And then at the end, we have spoken words or signs. And I put those at the end of our hierarchy because spoken words and signs, unless you use an approximation to maintain as a visual cue for a student, once they're out there, they disappear. Once we say something, it's gone. So our students often need something tangible to refer back to again, even from point A to point B, or, multiple times during an activity to remember what we're doing and what's happening. Having something tangible allows them to refer back to it. If we just tell them, oh, we're going to music, and then we head there, they have nothing. If they forget midway, they have nothing to refer back to, which is why we like those concrete symbols. So that's that slide.
This is Chris. Awesome. Thank you, Jen. And I see Laura, definitely, we're going to discuss that about symbol systems growing over time. Going to discuss that in a minute. Denise said, when a student will not tolerate hand under hand, what strategies do you recommend to create the same type of shared experiences? Did we already talk about hand under hand? I think maybe we talked a little bit about that last time. I was trying to think if there's something coming up. So I'll just address that now quickly. It's a really great question. If a child won't tolerate hand under hand, it's usually because they have a history of sort of like being surprised or, having unanticipated tactile interactions. So there may be a sensitivity on the hands. And if they're not ready for it, instead try kind of paring that back to just, the first step would be just tolerating tactile contact. The second would, like of any kind, finger or hand lightly on the shoulder. Then can they tolerate, sort of like remaining in contact along the arm, the elbow, under the forearm. And over time, you're sort of building towards tolerating and even, mutually interacting with hand under hand. It just may take some time. There's also an article that I wrote a little while ago for Paths to Literacy about visually guided reach for kids with significant motor difficulties or lack of voluntary motor control. And there's a hierarchy that we created there that shows like that step-to-step process. So if hand under hand is too much to handle, what are like 5 or 6 steps before that? So you could find that on Paths to Literacy. I think if you I can pull up the link for you later. Jen.
Chris, we have brought up lots of great questions. Mm-hmm. So one says this works for objects, but what about other parts of speech? For example, verbs, question words, etc. And that led to another question about core vocabulary too.
Great questions. I think we're going to go into talking about all of those things in a little bit. So can we hold those questions? And then if we don't answer them in the content, then we'll go back to them. So if we don't answer them, just ask them again. But I think we're going to get there. Oh, thank you, Kathy, for putting that link in there. There's a little hierarchy you can see there. Really good questions. Are these those same symbols? These are not stacks. These are not the APH stacks, but I think this is that newer APH system that they created.
Yeah, this is the kit that they have created that you get. Right. They're not pre-made, but they come as a kit that you can make yourself. And they are advertised as CBI friendly because they have contrasting colors. And they are grouped by so I think like nouns are one color and verbs are one color. So they're grouped by the parts of speech, but, symbolically.
Very
are they accessible?
Yes, this is Chris. Very, this could be very problematic for individual students, right? And I think that that term, anytime you hear that term CVI friendly, you should sort of have a red flag up about, well, for who, right? For what individual with CVI? So the notion of creating a universal material that works for every child with CVI is just, that's incorrect. So certainly may be appropriate to individual students, but then other students it won't be right for. So you want to just remember to individualize and think about your specific child or student. But there are, just think about those questions of iconicity, right? Visual as well as conceptual. These are very abstract conceptually, and visually, they don't really pop out a lot. The kind of test that I'll give, it's not a perfect test, but the test of how much any particular material or visual target stands out to really be, you know, easier to see and process for a child with CVI who is, you know, estimated like around early to late phase 2. If you talk about kids who, you know, you're trying to figure out what materials would be appropriate for them around, what symbols would be appropriate for them around in phase 2 somewhere. If you're looking at your screen right now, look about 2 or 3 inches to the left of the, or actually try looking above. Okay, so look about 3 inches above your screen. So you're not looking directly at your screen, you're looking 3 or so inches above it. Can you touch the symbol for the symbol with the red triangle on it? And try. Good, that one stands out pretty well. Can you, and really look 3 or 4 inches above your screen. Don't look down at it directly. Can you touch the symbol for go, which has the silver washer on it? That's a little harder. I'm not getting that very accurately. The ones that pop out or stand out are the ones that you can access even if you're not making eye to object contact, not looking directly at something and fixating on it. We're going to do that same test when we look at high-tech communication displays with symbols. Okay. Again, this is not perfect because we can't do a simulation of CVI because CVI is a visual processing issue. We can't like put on goggles and see what would it look like to have CVI. But try accessing different materials based on levels of complexity without making eye to object contact. Looking, you know, 5-6 inches to the left or above or to the right of, and see how accurate you are in accessing that material. And these are not great for that. Okay.
Chris, one other thing, there was a question about suppose a student uses sign language, but deaf and have CVI. So in relation, our matrix does have considerations for ASL included, but definitely when you're looking, for example, at symbols like that, you know, for our students who are deaf and hard of hearing, that goes back to think about what those kids are also have to learn receptively as well. They might have the receptive vocabulary to understand what those words mean. So even if you're pairing it with a spoken word or a sign, they're not there yet. We need to be choosing symbols or objects that are concrete so that you can match a sign with a concrete object, same as you would with an infant just developing first words. How do we do that? We match, we label everything we see, we touch, we do. That's where we start before we start getting into more abstract concepts that are hard to tangibly understand.
This is Chris. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. And thanks for answering that one. So, right, what we were looking at with those, these tangible symbols. Now, how about these? Same kind of issue, right? We have symbols that look quite a bit like each other if you're not fixating on them, that could easily be mistaken for each other. You have symbols that are conceptually abstract and visually abstract. So it's not all bad. There are some things that pop out, but it's not great. And it's nice we have the black background. It's nice that we have spacing between symbols. We do have some colors that really do pop out, but we've also got some things that kind of blend together. And not to mention that these are line drawings, which are conceptually abstract as well. So we're going to look at a lot of different examples as we go on a little later in the session. We're going to look at a lot of examples of high-tech communication displays, and we're going to think about what's working, what's not working. And I kind of always go back to that little test of try looking to the side or to the top, above your screen, and see what you can access accurately. See what kind of blurs into the background and really doesn't stand out. Like the cue for bathroom there just completely blends into the background. There's nothing that stands out about it, and it would be very hard to access that if you were not making eye to object contact, direct fixation. Also, these little egg-headed people that we have in the PEX symbols, they all look alike. So they really don't pop out at all, especially for feelings. There's no distinction between one symbol or another if you have all of them up at once. Okay. So before we get too deep into those individual considerations, I want to kind of pose a question, which is a big question that comes up, and I'm not sure I really have the answer to this, but it's something we do need to be thinking about. You do not need symbolism and language to reach late phase 2 and phase 3, right? Because progress in cortical visual impairment is not associated with cognition or expressive language development. Okay, you can still have a child who is in phase 3 but is pre-symbolic. But how do you do those things that we always think of and use as our key focus for assessment in late phase 2 and phase 3? How do you identify, recognize, and discriminate two-dimensional symbols if you don't have symbolism and language? This is a big predicament, and it's something that we're going to have to come up with some alternative methods for assessing students in phase 2, late phase 2 and early phase 3 if they don't have symbolism and language. First of all, identification is not possible without symbolism. Okay, recognition is. Identification is when I show you something, I'm holding up my water bottle right now, and I say, what is this? And then the child has to be able to say, that is a water bottle, whether it's with language or with concrete symbols. They have to be able to give it a label with symbolism in order to identify, right? Recognition, you can say, you can hold up these two things. I'm holding up my coffee cup and my water bottle. Recognition is which one is the water bottle? And the child can look at, point towards, reach for, or indicate in some other way. So recognition you can do without expressive symbolism, but identification you can't. And discrimination is more like discriminating things by their features. Which one has a cylindrical shape? Which one is clear, right? These kind of things. And I see, Jen, are there like SLP terms, specific SLP terms we use for those things? Those are terms
SLPs use identify for receptive. We do not, but they will label, say that if the child, they will write IEP goals for the child to identify something and it's meant in a receptive manner.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. When I use those three terms, those are terms that are used in the CVI range. So we're talking about those in terms of visual identification, visual recognition, and visual discrimination. Okay, but it does have a connection with expressive language, which we address in our matrix. So we're going to look at that. This is a big overarching issue that we see. And thank you for clarifying that. Okay. Even photos can be visually and conceptually complex. Okay, so especially when they have overlapping features. That's a really gross photo that you included in the slideshow, Jen. Thank you. All right. So of course, with photos, we might still need to separate out overlapping things and point out information using highlighting salient features. Okay. That's really gross. All right.
Anybody know what it is?
Oh yeah, did everybody get it? Thank you for that, Jen. That's going to be in my dreams tonight.
For the sake of time, yeah. So everybody's gonna people are likely gonna get the spider, of course, because there's our salient features. What are we seeing? We're seeing the 8 long legs. That is actually a photo, thanks to Melanie, who's the head of the Hawaii Deafblind Project. It is a spider eating a giant cockroach.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
I'm glad to know that that's 5,000 miles away from me right now. All right. Lana asked, what do you recommend as a replacement of those egghead images? I'm glad I coined that term on a communication device to talk about feelings. We're going to look at that pretty specifically. The one thing I'll say right now is that I really have come to think, and Jen, tell me if you think differently, that the most important thing in symbol selection on a display, the most important thing is that for kids with CVI, is that the symbols are visually distinct from each other. Okay? Symbols that look too much like each other are going to be confused. Visually distinct symbols. So the problem with those egghead symbols for feelings is that they're not visually distinct from each other. You could have something that's equally abstract, but it's visually distinct, and so it's easier to kind of find and remember. And we're going to look at some specific examples of that. Okay, great question. We're going to come back to that. So the most important and the last thing we're going to really emphasize about using tangible symbols is that there are two, and these are our own distinctions that we've talked about in the matrix. There are two primary levels of using tangible symbols, two totally different levels. And you want to be really thoughtful about which level you're using. If you have a student who does not yet have symbolism, doesn't yet have the connection between a symbol and a referent, you're only using the symbol system to anticipate activities. And that's what Jen spoke about a bit in the last session, an anticipation calendar that's really just one symbol at a time. You can have a robust vocabulary, but you're not looking at that whole set of vocabulary at the same time, because it doesn't make sense to look at 20 different symbols if you don't know the meaning of any of them. You want to focus on learning the individual symbol and making that connection. Okay. If you have a student who already has symbolism, knows the meaning of symbols, is able to use them expressively, individually, to connect with activities, to make a request, to refuse, and so on, then your student is ready for a transitional communication system, which is a more complex use. Transitional communication systems include things like choice boards, dynamic displays, right? Like a communication display, whether it is connected to a voice output device or not. A sequence board, a calendar system of the whole day, using symbols for literacy to do step-by-step or, first, then sequence board. That would be a more advanced system. If you think about it, it makes sense. I know that in the school setting, it's very common for every student to have their own daily calendar. And at the beginning of the day, you go through the daily calendar. First, we're going to have a snack. Then we're going to go to the bathroom. Then we're going to go to circle time. Then we're going to go to gym. Then you have speech and so on. But if you're showing that to a student, looking through those symbols one at a time to a student who doesn't know the meaning of any of those symbols, all you're really saying is touching this, looking at this, touching this, looking at this, and there's no connection between what those things mean. So if that's the case, you want to take a step back and do the anticipation calendar. And if you need a reminder of what, steps for an anticipation calendar and so on, they're in our matrix, in the appendix of our matrix. We're going to bring that up and talk through it again in a little bit too. Clarifying some traditions about using tangible symbols. That's why we're calling them concrete symbols, really. Tactile tangible symbols are traditionally used for students with ocular visual impairments based on their tactile properties, right? This we talked about a little bit already. Okay. For kids with CVI, a child with CVI is a visual learner who may also benefit from some tactile interaction with something or auditory interaction. But kids with CVI are visual learners who need to learn over time how to use their vision and make sense of the information that they're getting visually. So instead, we're selecting and developing, designing concrete symbols based on their visual properties, not their tactile. Okay, so it's the opposite of what we usually do. We're thinking about the level of complexity of any particular symbol in terms of visual complexity and symbolic complexity. And then we're making adaptations based on where that child falls on the CVI range, right? Like we would for any other material. Here's a cool example that a TVI in New York made of basically like the APH stacks, tangible symbols, but the symbol for Lightbox, she got one of those little kind of stick-on light switches from Home Depot. You can get them for like $5 and use that as the tangible symbol. And it's cool because you can turn it on and off. So it kind of mimics that, you know, the actual visual experience of turning on the light box. So I thought that was a pretty cool, concrete, visual and interactive tangible symbol for a child with CVI that might be different from what we do for a child with an ocular visual impairment. Tangible symbols, you might also think about labeling the environment. That supports orientation mobility, but it also gives more opportunities to experience that symbol. This is a picture on the top left of the APH symbol for speech, tacked on side of the outside of the speech room. A funny story about that symbol, everyone always complains, why do you have these little weird lips for the speech symbol, especially for kids who might not be verbal communicators? I was at a school once where a student was using tangible symbols and the speech office was labeled with this cue. And I saw two little girls walking down the hallway and maybe like age 10 or 11. And one was saying to the other and pointing to it and said, "Oh, did you know that? Did you know that's where the kissing booth is?" So I thought that was a more accurate representation of what that symbol looks like. All right. I'm going to show you a short little video of a student who is in mid phase 2, probably around mid phase 2, and an emerging symbolic learner. What I want you to do as you watch this video is think about what are the CVI adaptations and what are the communication adaptations. So we have this balance, right, that Jen spoke about. How are we addressing both vision and level of communication here? So let's just go back. Just gonna pull up the video. This is a young girl who's in, mid phase 2, I would say, emergent, symbolic. She knows the meaning of some of these symbols. Okay, and she's working with her speech pathologist here. So look at the multimodal communication as well as the CVI specific adaptations and see how many you can point out. Type them in the chat box as you think of them.
Go to your schedule. Yes. Seriously. Okay. Great. Like, Miss Sarah, she's still here, but we'll do it for now. Good. Over. Okay. Your book is all done. Hmm? Yes. Okay, Maeve. Now it's time for speech. Move it over. Speech. Hmm? And then morning meeting.
10. Miss Becky, what's after morning meeting? Drink. And then drink. Okay. Yes, it's time for a speech right now. Are you ready? Let's go.
Okay. Okay, this is Chris. I wanted to say, sorry, Laura, I missed your message earlier and I was just reading it. And yeah, definitely, it can feel overwhelming, right? All of the considerations and all of the multiple modalities that we need to be thinking about and all of the adaptations. And I agree, as somebody responded to you after that, it can be overwhelming, but that's why you need to have, and you really should have, a great collaborative team with professionals from various different roles with various background who are providing a lot of support and input throughout this process. I think that for kids with CVI, you must have what I would call a CVI point person, whoever that person is. You need to have at least one person on the team who has a strong understanding of CVI and can really lead the team in those considerations. And then the various expertise can come together, right? But it could be anyone. It could be a TVI, speech pathologist, an OT, a classroom teacher, a PT. It could be whoever. But somebody needs to have that strong CVI background. And if they don't, you really need to build it into the child's IEP that your child's team gets training to understand the unique impact of CVI so that you can look at what these adaptations might be and that they become less overwhelming. The other little thing I wanted to say about that too is that, remember, we're always honoring the child's current mode of communication, whatever it might be. So your child is already communicating, even if it's, as Jen talked about last session, even if it's on a very early emergent level. So it's about building that, right? It's about figuring out what is your child already doing right now, and then what are the scaffolds that we need to implement to get your child to that next place. So I hope that is encouraging in the face of all this overwhelming stuff. We wanted to give you in the matrix really extensive considerations so you don't have to think of everything. You have everything in front of you and you just have to look at it and see what fits best with your child. And thank you for that. I appreciate you, your comment. Okay, so I saw many of you putting into the chat box some of the things you had observed, right? On the CVI side, visual adaptations, we have partial objects, right? They're not yet 2D because this child is in kind of that mid-phase 2, not quite ready for 2D at this point, kind of getting there, but still needs 3D objects to look at. There's a black backdrop to reduce the visual clutter. There's spacing between the symbols. I saw several people pointed out the red rectangle to the left side, which highlights or anchors the child's visual attention to the activity that we're doing now. And you see it's a little bigger than the symbol itself, which makes it almost look like a window framing the symbol we're doing now. So it anchors her attention to it better. There's also red tape on the rim of the finish box, which is really important because most kids with CVI have difficulty with their lower visual fields. So that red tape is going to make that object in the lower field pop out a little more than it would otherwise. So she can really see that it's there. Marcy just mentioned, and I'm so glad you mentioned it, Marcy, and hi, nice to see you, that the child's back is to the classroom. I really wish when I was taking this video that I had turned my camera just for a second to show you, because this is a very busy classroom. There's a lot going on. And the decision to even have the activity in this place where it's happening itself is a CVI adaptation. And that's something that should be in the child's CVI schedule. That those types of activities that require a lot of use of vision are going to happen with her back to the busy classroom. So she doesn't have that complexity to deal with.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
In your discussion with this, can you just kind of clarify the difference between contrast and complexity when it comes to CVI? There was a question about, there's been a lot of comments about contrast, and just making sure that we clarify the difference in those two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is Chris. Thank you. CVI doesn't cause contrast sensitivity issues. So kids with CVI don't need increased contrast any more than any child needs increased contrast. There are other eye conditions like glaucoma or cataracts that cause contrast sensitivity issues, but that's not a factor in CVI. It's actually dealing with visual complexity. So the reason that we use black backdrops is not for contrast, it's to reduce the complexity of things around, right? If you're on a black backdrop, you have less complexity. And also the contrast thing, there's no reason not to use increased contrast. We all benefit from increased contrast. It's universal design, right? It's good for everyone. That's why we have those, many of you might use that feature on your phone where your text on your phone or your iPad is in reverse or inverse contrast. That's why our presentation is in inverse contrast, because it's good for everyone and it actually reduces visual fatigue for everyone. But it's not, it's just a point to clarify. Christy's asking, the red is most easily seen by the brain? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, you don't even need to have a visual cortex in order to see red. You can process the color red with your eyes alone, and your optic nerve can perceive red. Okay. That's probably an evolutional thing, because things in nature that are red are things that we should probably stay away from and not eat. So great. So you have the CVI adaptations, and then you have communication adaptations too to balance that are appropriate for this student. We're using concrete symbols. We're also, this is real multimodal communication, right? Visual sign with tactile modifications, which means that this student is getting some visual sign and she is watching the teacher's hands, but she's also looking for that tactile contact because she's not quite ready to just follow the visual sign. Also, this is a child who, 2 years before this video was almost entirely tactile sign receptive because her vision wasn't developed enough. It was, she was in phase 1. She wasn't looking at hands at all. So as she developed, we saw this modality adapt with her. Constant contact and tactile support, the use of speech and audition with very, very clear and simple speech because she does have dual cochlear implants as well. And then prompts and wait time are really nice in this video. So someone had mentioned, I think Laura Elmer had mentioned earlier, can we talk a little bit about systems that grow with a child? We don't want to get stuck with a system that can't grow. We want to develop systems that grow with the child as they go from 3D to 2D, and also as they go from pre-symbolic to symbolic and on into developing complex language. So this young girl and her team, once she learned all of those symbols, the team knew that she was ready in her visual skills to use 2D symbols, but they didn't want to get rid of those symbols that she knew and make her start all over again. So instead, they took a photograph of those 3D symbols, and now we start to develop a 2D system. Okay, so we went from a 3D to 2D system, but it's the same symbols, and we can start to expand the use of this as her language expands too, expressively, to a bigger communication board. Okay, a manual board, as well as putting those symbols on a device to start to build communication using a high-tech system. Okay, and you can do those two things at the same time if that's appropriate for the child. One question I always get from speech pathologists is about wanting to have the maximum number of symbols on a display. Okay, I think that's a preference of most speech pathologists who work with AAC, that we don't want to just have 2 symbols on a display. We want to start with the most symbols possible. And if that's the case, that's totally fine, but you want to be thoughtful of how much of a complex array can your child deal with visually. Important point is that for CVI, it's not about the size. So it's not that she needs these giant symbols, it's that she needs the display to be less complex. So it would be fine to have a little inch-tall symbol as long as there aren't a whole bunch of other symbols around it. That's going to be just as easy to see as a 4-inch tall symbol, as long as the background's not complex. If you never had those symbols, then you probably wouldn't use them as 2D ones, right? You'd probably start with photographs or, concrete shapes or, even sight words. Does CVI status in terms of range change quickly? It depends on the child and it depends on the intervention, right? I find in my experience that younger kids under the age of 5 tend to show much quicker progress, but individuals of absolutely any age can show progress in time with CVI, with the right interventions. As Jen said, matte laminate is always good to reduce glare, definitely. Now, the only issue here with this last picture on the right is don't forget about visual fields, right? She's leaning over like that because she really needs a slant board. Okay. Some examples of interesting adaptations for visual fields. This was like a handmade one for a child's Riften chair, which was pretty cool. Using, I guess, duct tape. So when we talk about accessible modes of communication, and the question did come up about how many symbol systems does the student have to learn? It depends on the student, and it also just depends on what the team is using, right? So we don't want to overwhelm a student with, by changing up their symbol system all the time. Rather, we probably want to focus on one specific symbol system and let it grow over time and adapt as the child adapts. But we also want to, when we talk about multimodal communication, we're talking about not just a symbol system, also gestures and signs or, speech if appropriate, or combination of those things, and even behaviors as being communicative. So multiple modes and levels of communication, just like any of us uses. We all use conventional gestures when we wave hi, but we also may say hi too. So that's multimodal communication. Accessible modes of communication look different depending on whether your child or student is expressively at the pre-symbolic level, emerging symbolic level, or concrete level, right? Concrete means that they're at the level of using concrete symbols, like the tangible symbols we've talked about. Pre-symbolic is those 3 levels that Jen talked about in the last session. Students who are pre-intentional, unconventional, or unconventional in their expressive use of communication. And then abstract is if the child has words or language. And there are different definitions of language, of course, but the way that the communication matrix defines language is the combination of 2 or more symbols, 2 or more abstract symbols or words. So according to the communication matrix, more is not language. More is just an abstract word. That's a word. It's great. It's a first word. Language would be more drink, or more drink, or more play, more music. That's language. Okay. Whatever approach you use, there are various different approaches that are used by speech pathologists, educational teams, etc. And some schools I find have, really stick to a specific approach. total communication, shared forms of communication, aided language simulation, core vocabulary. There was a question, I think, about that. And then, have you guys able to see the slides? Everybody else see the slides?
I am, yeah. It looks like Marie's having trouble with it.
It might be in your own
Settings.
settings on Zoom.
I didn't change any settings when we went to break and came back, so I just stepped away from the computer. But
Weird.
I have you and Jennifer and Melissa are superimposed over the slides.
That's interesting. You probably want to like see if you can move us out of the way, or.
All right, I'll fiddle with it. Go ahead.
Okay. Let me just in case. Let me do a stop share and then share again.
And Chris, while you're doing that, there was a really good question that fits into. Aha!
Oh, cool. Great.
Thank you.
Into communication and CVI, where does spelling to communicate fit into all of this?
Oh, good question. Spelling is the use of abstract symbols, which are letters, right? And that's the combination of abstract symbols to form words. So yeah, I guess that would definitely be in the abstract level of communication. Yeah, it's an expressive use of language for sure. So if you're able to spell a word, then you have abstract. You're at the abstract level for sure. If you expressively use the alphabet, those are abstract symbols. They're not concrete. Just like sight words, using sight words would be abstract. Vision, language, learning, communication, participation, often shortened to vision, language, learning, is the approach and framework created by Dr. Roman and Dr. Blackstone in their chapter in the CVI Advanced Principles book on AAC and communication. So what Jen and I discussed with Dr. Roman and Dr. Blackstone is maybe how our model, the AAC CVI matrix, also fits into that. This is an approach framework. Okay, that means that it's a way of looking at things and almost like a philosophy for approaching intervention. So you can still stay true to any one of these and adapt individual materials in a more specific way. Okay. The one thing we did want to say about core vocabulary, which is a super controversial area, is that there is emerging literature, namely this article by Janice Light and a colleague who I'm not familiar with, Emily Lobsher, which actually suggests that core vocabulary lists for children who are at the real early emergent language development level is not as effective as it had previously been thought to be, because what they're suggesting is that emergent early language users require vocabulary that is more specific to their own experiences, okay, which is what we've been saying all along. We need not to use a generic set of words that are, commonly used in society. We need to use words that are motivating and preferential to our students and that are unique to their experiences. Okay. So we may think about a combination of these things. It's not to say that core vocabulary is totally wrong. It may work great for one student, but consider that for students who have very highly specific preferences and very unique experiences, that they may do better if you include some what would be considered fringe words in the core vocabulary approach, because those words are so meaningful and motivating to that student. Like a name of a favorite toy or an activity might be the first word that your child learns, not go, stop, like, want, the words that we see in core vocabulary lists. Okay. Yeah, and I see SLPs thankfully not tearing me apart right now. Agreed. You cannot build language without core vocabulary, but for emergent symbolic or concrete communicators, they may not be ready for that expansive language list, right? They may need to start with something that's more unique to their experiences. This is a whole bigger conversation that I just wanted to introduce that conversation to you. Linda Burkhardt, an AAC specialist, who you see a lot of her work out there, has this great quote: "We don't want to offer fragmented sets of communication. We want to always honor the child's right to use whatever communication system works best for them in a particular situation and context." Okay, so remember, the communication system is individual to the child. I don't know if we can share the article itself because it's copyrighted, but if you have access to finding those articles, there's the name of it. Core Vocabulary Lists for Young Children and Considerations for Early Language and Development. It's relatively new, right? It's in the AAC journal from 2020. But we can definitely share the link, the reference with you. Okay. Thanks for not tearing me apart. Who should use photos and line drawings? Well, line drawings are way more abstract than photos, so that's a consideration. A child who has enough vision to use photos or line drawings is definitely a child who would be considered. That is definitely not a child in phase 1. So 2D materials is phase 2 or phase 3 only. But also, it's not just are they in phase 2, which means they're ready for 2D materials. Do they also have an understanding of what the photo and drawing represents? And that goes back to that whole conversation about iconicity that we spoke about before. There's good and bad photos, and then there's photos that are just ugly. Okay, you probably want to avoid shadows. I'm just going to show you a handful of maybe what not to do. Shadows are not great. That looks kind of scary, right? Very complex photos are not great. Even though this might be the trampoline in its real environment, that's very complex 2D photograph to show a student to refer to their trampoline. Sometimes you pull images on, stock photos on Google Images or something like that, and you might think this is a great photo to use for the one on the bottom left there for orange, but there's too many overlapping shapes there, so it kind of creates a weird shape when you blur your eyes a little bit or look away from it that doesn't look like an orange. You probably would just want to pick one, not a group of them. The water fountain in the school, yeah, sure, it's a real photo of the real water fountain in the school, but what we really see in this photo is all that bright red stuff there. So we don't need all of that information, and it takes over in that photo. The visual components also need to be conceptually appropriate, like we've been talking about, sort of ad nauseum. A big pet peeve of mine is those line drawings that show signs, someone making a sign or sign language. If you're going to use that, why not just use the sign itself, right? Why are we using a line drawing to represent a sign? Sign is more concrete and it's also more functional. A lot of these line drawings from the Mayer Johnson symbols or PECs are very abstract. I mean, look at that one on the left there. I guess that's the symbol for shadow, but in order to get that concept, to understand that symbol, you need to have so many abstract concepts, and you also need to know what an arrow is, and that an arrow is telling us to look at something specific. Okay. Nice little sequence of a child with CVI making a choice based on looking at 2 photos. I wish I had a video because the teacher is holding up these 2 photo symbols, which are photographs of real objects. And what she would do, she would hold them up at eye level, spaced apart a good 6 inches. And then she would add a little shake or movement to the symbol to get the student to shift his gaze to look at it. Stop and just consider it for a second. Now move the other one to get him to shift his gaze toward the other one. Stop and look at it a second. Then he's reaching, he's kind of looking away a little bit. That's okay. He's made a selection, and then immediately it's paired with the actual object that it refers to. Okay, so pretty straightforward. In terms of matching photos to objects, this is one way to start to begin to make the connection in order to make a choice. And I also was thinking about this in terms of an interesting concept development piece, which is not just matching an object to a photo of itself, but starting to pair out, does your student understand and is able to match the components of an object to a photo of the whole object? Meaning, could I show the child the pig photo, the photo of the little pig toy, and give him the object that goes with it, those little coins, and say, which one does that go with? Right now, we're starting to pair more, to recognize or identify a piece of an object as fitting with the whole, which is an interesting part of concept development and visual concept development. All right, so we can kind of go on and on and on here. And yeah. Yeah, it would be a good idea to have photos available digitally, especially in a salient feature dictionary. I've given you a lot of good resources and examples. There are plenty of good ones on paths to literacy. This is a nice one from Rachel Bennett, who is a parent of a child with CVI and also works with the CVI Now for Perkins. And she had a great example of a sequence board for her son. And it's a nice example of using 2D images of real concrete objects that are actually used by her son against this black background with the yellow to highlight it, make it pop out. Very concrete, and then the board itself is pretty concrete and visually simple. Okay, straightforward. She also allowed us to share this case study about her son's communication system, which is a little while ago, over a year ago. So I'm not sure where he's at with it now, but what she said at the time was that he is able to attend to 2D pictures on the iPad or maybe on that sequence board, but it's challenging. It's a visually taxing activity, so he gets easily visually fatigued, right? So he also needs a backup tactile calendar system that's 3D. Okay, so even though he's using 2D, it doesn't mean that he can use it all the time. He may still benefit from a more concrete 3D system. And she shared these examples of his 3D tangible symbol system, which I also think are pretty solid in terms of the visual as well as the communication level adaptations. Okay. You can see these symbols really pop out. They're very concrete. Okay. Even like the bathroom one is like the same kind of flusher from the toilet. The one for the pool, for going to the pool, is a piece of an old life jacket. These are some nice examples of tangible symbols. Okay, so that's to say, even though he can access 2D, he still may need a 3D backup for when he's more visually fatigued. Individualized intervention programs are what we're advocating, right? Unique, based on the unique impact of each characteristic on the individual child. There's no ready-made program for CVI intervention, so it'd be wrong to suggest that all kids with CVI need this, right? Need one thing. Usually I find if someone learns a little bit about CVI, but not a lot, you come back and the classroom is painted black and the chairs are all outlined with red electrical tape, and it's overkill. We don't need to do that kind of over-adaptation. Not every kid with CVI needs that controlled of an environment. Strategies are misleading because you can't just, place them, you can't just insert them into any student's intervention plan. But I think that it's good for us to be able to share ideas with you and examples so that we can kind of pick them apart. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to walk through our matrix and look at some possible examples of different things. Okay. Now, we're not going to go through and review, intervention approaches by each phase. But we do have that stuff here for you if you need it. This is just kind of background stuff about phase 1. Okay, some things to think about for kids who are in phase 1 is a child in phase 1 is a visual learner who's not using their vision very much throughout the day. And they need practice using their vision in order to build stable visual behaviors. So it's harder to implement an intervention plan that includes visual adaptations throughout the day, because a child in phase 1 needs practice just looking at things for the sake of looking at them. A child in phase 1 just needs experiences with looking at things that are motivating to look at. High level of environmental control when we're using vision. So what's that going to mean for communication? Communication is a taxing activity. So we're going to need probably to have some tactile components, or maybe auditory if possible. That doesn't mean that we're going towards, pre-Braille. That means that we're adding some tactile or 3D components that are accessible to the child without having to use their vision. So the whole variety of different things that we might be thinking about for tactile adaptations, we could think in a lot of different directions with that. There's a lot of stuff out there. You can still use visual materials, but they're probably going to need to have a tactile, definitely at least a 3D component to them. Okay, we'll get into that a little bit more. Now, what about auditory scanning or motor memory access for phase 1, or really for any phase to that point? Could you have a student who is in phase 1 and using an extremely complex 2D system like this? I think this is LAMP or something, but accessing it from motor memory, meaning they don't even need to look at it. They know where all the symbols are based on, modeling and experiences with doing that. You could, yeah, sure, why not? But if you're going to do that, if you're going to make the device or the communication system about motor memory access, then reduce the visual complexity so that it doesn't overstimulate the child. You could literally just dim the screen, and the student, if they really are doing it for motor memory, they can do this without any visual. They're just doing it based on knowing where the symbols are. And in that case, the symbols are really only there for the sighted adults who are looking at it visually. Okay. So I have seen kids with CVI who are able to access high-tech devices without looking at them. If they're doing it effectively, fine. Why would you limit their ability to access that if that's working for them?
Chris, did you see there's a good question in the chat box?
Yeah. Was it?
What if a phase 1 child has no intentional hand movements? Would you still use tactile and do hand under hand?
Cheryl, that's a good question.
Because then even as hand under hand, you're still the one prompting the communication. It's not really, the child's spontaneous.
Yeah. If a child has intentional hand movements, does not have intentional hand movements, yeah, you can still use hand under hand, but that's not going to ever be an independent modality for the student, right? So you can do it as a mutual or shared modality, and you should, right, to support exploration. But that's not ever going to be an independent modality for that student. So we want to support the child's independent communication by offering them some possibilities that are that they're able to do independently, which might be related to an eye gaze system, but we'll talk about that in a second too. That's a hard one. Eye gaze systems for kids with CVI.
If it's phase 1, some students have used a pod system with an if they're a child that has auditory access,
yeah,
can use a pod system with auditory scanning. And sometimes children have used even like a switch, a head switch, or a knee switch, or something just to, if they have intentional movement, to maybe even activate one switch to confirm something like that. So using it with a auditory assisted scanning with a partner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Auditory scanning or motor memory access, both kind of, in that similar. Oh yeah, head switch, for sure. Absolutely. There's also another question that that has come up before that's similar to this one, which is I was working with a student who whose best visual field really didn't have the great lower visual field access, and the best visual field was really like upper right. Okay, but so in order for a communication device to be accessible, it had to be like on a gooseneck stand and up in the upper right. But he didn't have the motor access to be able to reach that high to the upper right. He could do smaller reaches toward the lower part of the screen, but that wasn't his best visual place. So that was a student that we actually ended up using a hand switch, which he could use. If he couldn't, we could do a head switch too, to scan to scan over the array and then be able to select the one that he wanted. So you have to be able to think think outside the box and find out what is that combination. Yeah, eye gaze we'll talk about in just a second. Okay. Remember, concrete forms of AAC are not an end in themselves, meaning tangible symbols are not the end. They're a means to get towards symbolism and language. So we want those symbols to eventually phase themselves out. It's not going to be, you're not creating an issue by saying, well, we're going to use these symbols and then eventually we're going to phase them out towards language. They're intended to be that. They're intended to be a stepping stone towards developing language, not the final mode of communication. And you have 3D forms that can progress to 2D, like we show with the photo, and 2D symbols in the same way can progress to being abstract symbols, letters, and sight words. And the process is a slow one of phasing out one or two at a time and matching them and substituting them. This was a cool example, timely because of the question. This is not for a communication system, but this is integrating an accessible switch into a self-directed experience, right? So this is a student in phase 1 who, for like a downtime, vision CVI activity, they had, she has a left preferred visual field, and she's able to activate the head switch, which is connected to the fan that blows against the pom-pom and gives it some movement, which is easier for her to see. And so even though this is not for a communication use, it's a nice supplement to sort of start to build in those skills, which maybe eventually we're going to start to really use for a communication system. I thought this was an innovative example. Okay, so when you go through the matrix, and maybe I should just go back to the matrix and show you really quickly. Okay, X out of that. Okay, so again, here's the matrix. Okay, and the first several pages are just kind of like introduction, explaining a lot of the stuff that you've been hearing about on Tuesday and today. Some of these exact examples are here for you, and they're explained, at length. There's these levels, the levels of the communication matrix. These 7 levels are aligned with those 3 levels that we talked about expressively. Emerging pre-symbolic, a child who doesn't yet have an understanding of a symbol and communicates mostly through behaviors that have to be interpreted. You have concrete symbolic communicators who are communicating with concrete symbols. And then you have abstract communicators who use words or language. Okay. So as we go on, we've got some general CVI considerations. And then as Jen showed you last time, this is where you're really starting with your student. You want to find out what is the alignment of their CVI phase. And we split phase 2 into early and late because there really is a very big difference between early and late. That difference being that students who are in late phase 2 are using eye to object contact, direct visual fixation, looking right at something, whereas kids in early phase 2 are not making that direct fixation and may appear to almost be looking past or through things, maybe have emerging eye to object contact. So we want to know, where is your student in their CVI phase, and how does that align with where they are in their expressive communication? So you might, and I'll just annotate this, You might mark an X where your student is. Your student is in late phase 2, or a check mark, late phase 2 concrete symbolic communicator. Or maybe they are in between early and late phase 2. They're like a 4 to 5, like mid phase 2. So you may mark both of those boxes. Maybe they're also in between stages here, right? So maybe they're also in between emerging pre-symbolic and concrete. Whatever combination or whatever you're filling out there, that is going to, let me see, that is going to align with what you see at the bottom. Okay, below, you see each phase with a column for each level of communication, each of those 3 levels, and then you see extensive recommendations for each one. So our student that we just came up with as an example is in late phase 2 and is a concrete communicator. So I'm going to skip all this phase 1 stuff, skip early phase 2, go down to late phase 2, concrete communicator. And we're just looking at that middle column, right? So we have considerations for adapting symbols or communication systems at that level for a child in late phase 2 who's a concrete communicator. And we have them as little boxes because what we want you to do is just check off the ones that are relevant to your student. And those are your main talking points for adapting a communication system for that student. So you can keep going down. And there's extensive recommendations or considerations for sign language, as well as for tactile input systems like protactile and haptics. And that's what you have. You also have got this extensive appendix, which is an index of all the terms explaining all these things like what we've talked about today, iconicity, tangible symbols, examples of those levels, and so on. Thanks, Marcy. I see a question. How does one interpret the unique needs for visual breaks like watching video games? And then also, how does one define looking as in visually attending versus from a CVI perspective versus joint attention for communication expressed by looking at something? Okay, I think I understand that. Well, the unique needs for visual breaks, like that's individual, that's to each student, right? How a child is showing you that, depending on what behavior or communication they're using to show you that they need a break. In terms of looking visually, it's different from joint attention, which, a child can express joint attention but not look at someone. They can express tactile attention, or they can, even sometimes for kids with CVI, they will look away in order to listen to you because it's too hard to look and listen at the same time. And that should not be misinterpreted as not attending, right? Because it's actually the opposite. Okay. So, all right. So instead of walking you through, each and every phase and its, unique needs, I would just recommend that you refer to where your child or student is on that AAC CVI matrix, and you'll see what those possible adaptations are. So dealing with some other areas of communication and intervention, partner-assisted scanning. What does that look like for a child with CVI? Well, you might do partner-assisted scanning, which is pointing, showing, speaking messages to a student, and the student will select however they're selecting. You as the communication partner is doing the scanning, and the child has a way of telling you, yes, that's the symbol I want. It could be hitting the table, it could be eye gaze, it could be blinking, it could be a variety of things. Whatever your student is using.
No, it just said unmuted, and I went to...
Someone is muted. Someone's unmuted. Everybody make sure you're muted. Partner-assisted scanning can also be adaptable to children with CVI, like with a window, right? With a see on the top right there, you've got a little yellow cardboard cutout window. You could put one on a popsicle stick rather than holding it in your hand, just to reduce the complexity. And you're hovering it over the symbols. And in the same way, you're just waiting for your student to select it. You could also use a flashlight, right, for partner-assisted scanning, showing one symbol at a time with a flashlight. So we're just using CVI adaptations to adapt communication approaches like partner-assisted scanning. Partner-assisted scanning, of course, is reliant on a responsive communication partner. And in the case of kids with CVI, it's reliant upon a communication partner that understands that child's CVI needs. Do they need a flashlight? Do they need you to shake the symbol? Do they need you to hover over it with a, with a window, a cutout? So same kind of thing. Here's a little cutout window for scanning or visually exploring a complex book. You could use the same one for a communication system or a highlighter or a pointer. The windows tend to be a little bit better because they really direct the student towards the center of the attention. And you can adapt those however are needed to your individual student. Okay, we're jumping around a little bit here because we're addressing a lot of different things. Potential issues with high contrast symbols. Oh, the one last thing I want to say to jump back about those windows, make a window that is the same size, like a little bigger than your symbol itself. So you could have a window for, the Proloquo app. You could have a window for a tangible symbol. It might be bigger. But a window is a great way to direct a student's attention to it. You can use different colors for them. The red frame is not going to distract from what they're looking at because you don't necessarily need to hold it there. You're kind of, that's just to direct the child's attention towards that area. It's just making it pop out basically. For one child, the red frame might be distracting, and you might want to use something different. But you don't want a clear window, right? You want probably a color that pops out. You could have a black window or like an occluder basically that blocks off the background information too, and that might work for another student. Okay, high contrast symbols. Another time that I've heard people say these are CVI friendly symbols. Be cautious of that. These symbols all look alike, right? They all pop out. Yeah, sure, they're bright and colorful, but they're all bright and colorful. And so they're going to be overstimulating and very complex. There's a lot of complex detail in these symbols. So again, you can try that same technique of looking, 3 inches, 6 inches to the left of your screen. And this is actually even worse than those symbols that we looked at earlier, right? So look 6 inches to the left of your screen and try to touch the symbol for want. I bet nobody can do it. It's a symbol that has 2 hands with a little green line and a red box above it. You can't do it if you're not making eye to object contact because these are very complex, even though they're bright colors. This was an interesting one with a speech pathologist I was working with who learned about salient features and tried to adapt the symbols to highlight the salient features. And in theory, great idea, but look what it looks like in practice. It actually looks even more complex than without the salient features. So this doesn't work either, right? And I think it's a nice example of what not to do that would be easy to do if you learn a little bit about CVI and you think, oh, my child's in phase 3, it's all about salient features, so let's do that. But we actually made it look more complex. Now, this is another very complex communication system. We've got real photographs of real objects, but those photographs are small inside of the boxes. The boxes are all outlined in red, so all we really see is this kind of red blur. And the photos themselves are complex with stuff in the background, furniture, other objects. The angles are not great. And we have these red sight words that are also standing out and making it hard to focus on the pictures. Okay. Now, even though this looks more abstract, right, than the photographs, it's actually more simple. because these symbols, even though they are conceptually abstract, at least they're visually distinct. So you can look away from the screen, try your test again, look 3-4 inches to the left and hit the symbol with the blue triangle on it. I could do it. Can you hit the symbol with the yellow star on it? Can you hit the symbol with the green arrow on it? And actually this is a little bit better. It's not perfect. There's still a lot to do here, but it's actually better because it's visually distinct. If you're going to do that, you might as well do this, right? And actually, I would even take away all the white. I would just have the symbols on the black background with no box around them. And this is a little easier still. Okay, still not quite there. We're getting there. I'm going to look at some other ones too. Here's an example of a student system that was a little better. These are real photos of real things that he uses. The bathroom photo on the bottom right is actually the real sign on the bathroom in the school. So it's a photo of the real one that he sees. And these stand out pretty decently. There's also nice spacing between them. There's also a yellow icon that hovers over the one that he's selected, which adds a nice piece to it. It's also on a gooseneck stand, which is supporting his preferred visual field. Okay, the question of eye gaze systems, when are they appropriate? Controversial question. First of all, they are not appropriate for anybody who is not able to make eye to object contact, okay, which is at the very earliest 4 to 5 on the range. You cannot access an eye gaze device if you cannot make eye to object contact and fixation. But even if you can make eye to object contact and fixation, consider students' visual fatigue and consider their understanding of 2D information. There may be a student who trials very well with an eye gaze system in a contained room where he's the only person in the room working with the representative from Dynavox or the AAC specialist. And the student looks like an appropriate device for that student. But that same student in a busy classroom is not able to use the eye gaze device at all because of multisensory complexity. Okay, so it really depends. And it may be that the eye gaze system is appropriate, but not in a busy setting, which means you're going to have a backup, because it can't be that the child only gets to communicate when they're in a controlled setting. Jen, you want to take this one?
Sure. So this was just brought up by a team for a CVI student I had recently in using these are called E-Tran boards. And they are a great way for students who don't have the motoric ability to be reaching out and using a device to use eye gaze. This is the low-tech version of using an eye gaze device. But just thinking in regards to our kids with CVI, how much complexity is there going to be and where this is held, making sure if this is something that's going to be utilized with a student, everything behind that clear plexiglass is visual complexity. So wherever you're, seated with that student, whatever's behind them could potentially impact their ability to utilize this device. So it's just it's going to be a very challenging thing for students with CVI.
This is Chris. Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't even thought about that. The clear board itself adds a lot of complexity, and even the centerpiece missing, right? To see the person's face, that adds a lot of complexity. Good point, Jen. Okay, I want to back up a little bit because I want to make sure that we hit on a few last important points. We have more here about, looking into phase 3, et cetera. Actually, let's look at this real quick. Okay. So we talk about salient feature instruction and salient features for kids in phase 3. Okay. What does that look like for symbols that are not visually distinct? Okay, so you have these examples. Remember our egghead people from the PEX system? Those two symbols, the feelings ones, look very similar to each other. So there's different approaches we could take to adapting these symbols or just picking new ones, right? So First, you could try thinking about the salient feature itself. If you actually want to instruct the student to recognize a unique symbol, then on the side, we might be doing some salient feature instruction to say, okay, this is the happy symbol because you can see the distinct element that's different. The salient feature of happy is the smile. The salient feature of sad is the frown. Okay, that's one thing we could do. Also consider that if you don't use the sight words, if the student's not using the sight words, get rid of them or make them as small as possible so that they don't take up any of the other visual clutter. So you might do this in terms of salient feature instruction if you want to include one of these symbols. But if you're going to do that, why not just do this? This is actually visually more simple. Why not just actually use a bubbled sight word that's visually distinct as well? Okay, we're going to show you some examples of using sight words. You can even start to use sight words for kids who don't have letter recognition yet if you make sure that those sight words are visually distinct. It's just as visually complicated as this. It's actually more simple, right, as the line drawings. How do using sight words relate to pre-literacy development? Well, all of the literacy development you still want to be doing at the student's appropriate level. But what we're looking at here is just visually distinct symbols. So we're not actually expecting that the student is reading the individual letters, but they could be learning to select a symbol based on the repeated use of it. And the point is that even though sight words are conceptually abstract, they're actually visually easier than these two things, which look pretty much exactly like each other. So we're providing some exposure to language, even though we're not expecting that the student actually is reading those words yet. They're identifying them as symbols, basically. And it's a possibility. It's not something you have to do. Yeah, they might know the symbol by learning the shape by using it over and over. Or you may phase these in, right? So like our student who we saw the video of, I think over time, we want to start phasing out those photographs with sight words one at a time. And once she learns it, maybe we can add another one or another few. Yeah, you want to fade them out. And yes, Robin, you phase out the bubbling. You use the bubbling in order to learn the word. And once they learn it, you don't need the bubbling anymore. And you don't read with bubbled sight words, with a whole sentence of bubbled sight words. You read by maybe highlighting one of those sight words that you're trying to focus on. And if you had, a whole sentence in bubbling, it would only make it more complex. Okay, there's more considerations for symbols. Remember, we looked at this one. If you're going to do this, why not just do this? I know that there is some controversy and some questions about using different colors for bubbling sight words, that it makes it more complex. For some children, it may make it more complex, and you may want to go with all the same colored bubble sight words. But I have worked with students who found this to be much more effective, right? So again, give our test. Now look about 3 inches, 4 inches to the left of your screen. Can you hit the word go? It's green. Got it. Can you hit the word play? It's blue. Can you hit the word like? It's red. Can you hit the word want? It's yellow. Can you hit the word help? It's orange. And it's even further away, but it's orange. The two that look too similar are U and E. Those would be hard. So those two are not visually distinct enough from each other. We should make a change there. But from everything we've seen so far, visually, this is actually the easiest. Visually, this is the easiest. It's easier than this. It's easier than a lot of those other examples we use. And for the partner-assisted scanning piece, or to start to learn the location of things, we could use our window. Yeah, I would recommend using bubble letters for core vocabulary versus symbols most of the time. Again, it's not an always. There's no ready-made go-to intervention, and it's going to depend on the student. But in general, if you're going to use a green arrow, why not just use the word go with a bubbled in green? Just as easy to find, and it's a pretty easy sight word to learn, even if you don't know the letters yet. Okay. I know we're getting short on time, so there's some more considerations here. There's different examples. A reminder to make a low-tech backup of any high-tech system. Again, not all these examples are things that I'm saying are good things, but they're just examples for critique. Couple other things I want to touch on. Remember, we looked at this crazy complex array in Speak for Yourself, or LAMP also has an equally complex array. But you don't have to start with the full array. You can start with the beginning word set, and that's much less complex. Now, still, there's some issues with the symbols there. Touch chat is not very great because the gradients that they give you are not very helpful. See, there's like a gradient, kind of like haziness to the colors. There's a lot of gray tones and pastel colors, and then the symbols themselves are pretty complex. Okay. Proloquo, it's got its pros and cons like any system, but one thing that's good about it is that you can make some basic adjustments like this, which automatically improve reducing the complexity. And you can do a lot better with the symbols themselves too, because you can substitute those symbols for photographs if you want to. You can change the spacing. You can highlight a symbol or take away the border. Okay. You can even take away the borders entirely. I know we're basically out of time. The last thing that I want to remind you of is about how important this sensory balance issue is. That when you're focusing on visual communication systems, you want to limit the auditory and tactile demands. And when you're focusing on auditory or tactile aspects of communication, you want to limit the visual demands. Okay, so you have to balance that sensory piece, and that could be a whole other webinar. This requires a lot of planning. The CVI learning media profile, this should go into the CVI schedule. My favorite slide of all time, multisensory overstimulation is observable if you're paying attention. Kids show you, like with this crazy face here, I'm really overstimulated. Stop doing that. So if you're paying attention, children will show you that they're overstimulated, and don't keep doing what you're doing. Reduce the complexity and look around the environment. Okay, so I think we're out of time. There's the visual and tactile modifications to sign are in the matrix itself. Okay, so you can look there for it. There's more resources. The Bridge School is a really great resource for AAC adaptations that are relevant to kids with CVI. And thank you.